This next bias is called the exponential growth bias. And this particular bias is near and dear to my heart because not only have I done a lot of research in this area, I've also realized that in this research, this exponential growth bias actually decides a lot of our decisions in our finances. So our expo growth bias, or I like to call it EGB, is our tendency to think in linear terms. Our tendency to think in linear terms and underestimate exponential growth. And underestimate exponential growth. Now, ever since we were in very young elementary school, we've been taught that linear lines, straight lines, that's how we think, like to go in straight terms. Exponential growth or compound growth has been called the eighth wonder of the world by Albert Einstein. And he goes on to say that he who understands this exponential growth earns it, and he who doesn't pays it in terms of paying off debt. And so I started seeing that in the research that I was doing, that people who understood, look, it doesn't grow, money doesn't grow in a straight line. If you give it enough time, it takes off and then it goes to the moon. So if you think of Warren Buffett, who's worth more than $100 billion right now in his 90s, I want you to think about how much do you think he was worth when he was 60 years old? So in terms of $1 billion, if he's worth 100 right now, when he was 60 years old, he was worth about $2 billion. Now that's nothing to sneeze at, but think about 60 years old, that's usually our typical time for retirement. But he didn't stop there. He's now using time on his side. And those last 30 years is when he has seen 98% of his wealth grow. And that's where we're saying the more we can save earlier, the more time we have on our sides, and exponential growth, this eighth wonder of the world, works in our favor. So now, but we tend to think in linear terms. And when we think, okay, my money's only going to grow like this, are you going to be more or less likely to save your money? Well, shoot, if I saw that, I'm going to spend it right now. But knowing that it grows like that, I'm going to be more likely to save it. And so our tendency to think in linear terms hinders our actual savings rate. And so that's where we said if we have $10,000, no other investments made, and that is going to earn 10% for 40 years. This is where we go back to our type 1 thinking. Type 1 takes a look at this and goes, don't need a calculator, I've got this. 40 years times 10%, that's 400% times 10,000. And so it's going to be like $40,000 or $50,000 in 40 years. You're welcome. That's your linear thinking. Because remember, if I have 10%, it grows compounding each year. Exponential growth compounds. So if you have $100 and you have 10%, first year you have 110. But next year, you're taking that 110 and multiplying it by 10% to get to 121. And that's how you start this curvature. So you get to see the real action here in these last years. So the actual calculation here is 10,000 times 1 plus 0.10 to the 40th power. And if you can use that, you can see that you'll have, with no other investments, $452,592.56. That is over 10 times more than the 40,000 that your type 1 thinker would get you to. And so knowing this, if you can override it, that's going to make you way more likely to save your money to invest for your future. Same thing is we have amortization bias. So now we kind of flip this when we think about paying off loans or paying off mortgages or student loans that we have. We like to think if we have a 30-year mortgage on my house, and that if I want to sell my house after making payments for 15 years, well, then I'll owe about half of what I originally took out. That's not the case. In fact, we go back to this inverted exponential form where it kind of looks like, here's our payoff. So if we have this initial 100% loan, depending on how much we're paying percentage-wise, we're going to be looking, if we have a 6% 30-year loan, I'm still at about 72% of my original balance, halfway through paying off the loan. Now remember that if you're taking out 20-year student loans, that you could be 37, 38 years old and still have 72% of your student loan balance outstanding. And that's where I'm a big proponent of buckling down, getting those loans out of your life. So you'd be 43 years old, you'd be me, just making those final payments. I don't want you to be like that. I want you to be on the path of building wealth by the time you get to my age here. But that's this amortization bias. We like to think that halfway through, in linear terms, we're going to be halfway paying it off. And it's just not the case. And then finally, last piece here before we talk about overconfidence is what we call this survivorship bias. And this is where I want to plant the seed around some of the information you might get around somebody reporting that they found something with their research that's really interesting. In this case, when we're talking about the survivorship bias is concentrating or analyzing only the people or things that made it past some sort of selection process. So the survivors are the ones that are analyzed, and the ones that didn't make the data. So you have to really take these results with a major grain of salt if we detect that some of the data was eliminated for various reasons. And that's where we see reports coming out that would try to say, hey, look at the mutual fund performance who have outperformed all these other mutual funds that are just the index-based funds. And you go, okay, well, what data set did you use? And they found out that we used only the mutual funds that stayed around for the entire sample period. And those were the ones that outperformed. And you go, okay, what about the 90% of the funds that didn't perform and so they went out of business? Well, they weren't included in the sample. So you have to remember when we say take that with a grain of salt, remember, take those findings with a grain of salt if you're using only the funds that have survived during the sample period. So that's just a term you might hear. There's a survivorship bias if you're trying to make some reporting of different findings, especially in mutual fund performance. All right, there it is. Final section is on overconfidence, and that is the last part of this section. So thanks for hanging in there with me. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, see you on that next video.